Who would have guessed that one simple dinner could shift my entire world? I'm Daisy, and this story starts with what I thought would be an ordinary evening. My boyfriend, Oliver, and I had just arrived in a neighboring town to meet his brother, Henry, and Henry's wife, Charlotte. Oliver and I had been together almost a year, and though I'd already met his mom, tonight would be my first time meeting the rest of his family. As we pulled up to Henry and Charlotte's luxurious home, I could feel my pulse quicken. Oliver gave my hand a reassuring squeeze, his silent way of saying, "Everything will be fine." We stepped up to the grand entrance, and after a brief wait, Oliver pressed the doorbell. Charlotte opened the door, greeting us with a warm smile. "Daisy, so nice to finally meet you," she said, pulling me into a hug. "Come on in. Henry's already waiting for us in the living room." Stepping inside, I was taken aback by the sheer elegance of their home. The living room felt like something out of a magazine. Rich colors, tasteful decor, and family photos tastefully scattered across the walls. It was a stark contrast to my modest apartment. I did my best to hide my nervousness, offering polite smiles as my gaze wandered over the room. Then, Henry entered, and time seemed to stand still for a moment. Tall, with a thick mane of hair that had just a hint of gray and striking green eyes, he radiated success and self-assurance. His black suit fit him impeccably, accentuated by expensive cufflinks that caught the light as he moved. Everything about his appearance spoke of poise, confidence, and accomplishment. He looked every bit the successful architect Oliver had described. "You must be Daisy," he said, extending his hand with a steady gaze. "Oliver's told me a lot about you." As I reached out to shake his hand, a sudden surge of electricity ran through me. I tried to hide my reaction, but noticed his eyes narrow slightly, as if he sensed my tension. Dinner was pleasant and laid back. Charlotte had outdone herself with an impressive meal, and conversation flowed naturally. Still, I couldn't ignore the feeling that Henry's eyes were on me more than I'd anticipated. His gaze was intense, lingering on me when he thought no one was watching, stirring a strange mixture of discomfort and excitement within me. As dinner wound down, Oliver and Henry fell into a discussion about work, but even as they talked, I could feel Henry's focus on me. His compliments grew more personal, each one carefully chosen, almost as if he were studying me. His attention both flattered and unsettled me. There was something in his gaze, a spark that made me feel recognized and oddly cherished, even though it left me feeling conflicted. Then, Henry raised a glass, toasting Oliver and me. His words were filled with warmth and sincerity, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was a deeper, unspoken connection in his tone, something that made my heart beat just a little faster. I tried to stay grounded, focusing on light conversation with Oliver and Charlotte about future plans, but every time I glanced at Henry, his gaze reignited a mix of emotions I struggled to push away. As the evening unfolded, Oliver's phone rang, and his expression immediately changed. It was clearly an urgent call, and after a brief conversation, he turned to me. "I'm so sorry, Daisy, but I have to go. It's an emergency at work. I'll try to get back as soon as I can." He gave me a quick kiss, his face reflecting genuine worry. Apologizing to Henry and Charlotte, he thanked them for the evening, hugged them both, and left. Henry and Charlotte encouraged me to stay, and though part of me felt uncertain, their genuine warmth made me agree. The three of us continued chatting about a range of topics, from Henry's architectural projects to design trends Charlotte was passionate about. The conversation was lively, and I found myself relaxing, intrigued by the stories they shared. When it was finally time to call it a night, Henry offered to show me to the guest room. His courteous, gentlemanly manner left a positive impression as he led the way. The moment we stepped into the guest room, I could feel Henry's presence growing closer, his gaze lingering just a little longer than necessary. He paused at the door, his hand resting on the frame, and offered a gentle smile. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask. We've got everything you might need here." His words were simple, but something in his tone felt layered, almost suggestive, igniting a flutter in my chest. I thanked him, wishing him good night, But as he closed the door behind him, a quiet tension remained, lingering in the room with me. I lay down on the bed, hoping sleep would carry away the whirlwind of thoughts. But rest was elusive, and instead, a strange excitement took over, a pulse I couldn't quite control. Oliver's absence felt like a chasm, amplifying this odd energy I sensed ever since Henry first looked at me that evening. I closed my eyes, desperately trying to shake it off to clear my head. Suddenly, I heard a soft creak as the door opened. My heart skipped a beat, and a chill ran down my spine. I kept my eyes shut, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But then a hand brushed mine, a gentle lingering touch that confirmed it was real. I didn't pull away. It was Henry. He sat down beside me, his fingers tracing over my hands, tender and soft. My body tensed and relaxed all at once, an unfamiliar warmth spreading through me as his presence enveloped me. Slowly, he moved closer, lying down behind me, his arms wrapping around me in an embrace that felt both forbidden and comforting. I knew I should stop this, but my body betrayed me, welcoming his warmth, his touch. I could feel his breath growing heavier, matching the rhythm of my own heartbeat as it quickened. We were both silent, yet that silence seemed to speak more than any words could. The room was filled with an unspoken understanding, an electricity that pulled us together even as I knew it shouldn't. His lips brushed the side of my neck, igniting a fire that I couldn't put out. I closed my eyes as if somehow that could help me escape this moment, but it was too late. His hands grew more insistent, and I turned to face him, surrendering to the current that swept us both up. It was a line crossed, an unspoken agreement that neither of us could deny. Our kisses grew deeper, a raw passion that seemed to erase everything else, the sense of right and wrong, the lives we were betraying. The night stretched on as if in slow motion, a silence between us that was filled only by our breaths and the language of touch. Words were unnecessary. Every glance, every embrace, seemed to speak of something far beyond physical attraction. It felt like an acknowledgement of a hidden connection, one that had been simmering just beneath the surface. Time became meaningless, and in those moments it was only him and me. When it was over, I lay there, trembling, overwhelmed by a mix of emotions that I couldn't quite untangle. Henry was beside me, still catching his breath, but eventually he sat up. His eyes met mine, and I could see in them the same blend of desire, regret, and guilt. For a moment I thought he might stay, that we might share some final moment of clarity. But reality soon returned. He carefully rose, slipping back into his clothes as quietly as possible. I watched him move toward the door, pause, and look back at me one last time before he slipped out, closing the door behind him. Alone in the dark, shame began to wash over me, heavy and unrelenting. I buried my face in my hands as tears slipped down my cheeks. Somehow, it felt like more than just a mistake. It was as if something had irrevocably shifted within me, like a part of myself had changed forever. I lay there for hours, my mind spiraling through guilt and regret until exhaustion finally claimed me. I woke at dawn, feeling a heavy weight on my chest. The reality of what had happened crashed down on me, each memory hitting like a wave. How had I let this happen? Oliver, Charlotte. I had betrayed them both. I knew I couldn't stay here another minute. I slipped out of bed, moving as quietly as I could while I dressed. The house was still. Every sound felt amplified as I tiptoed toward the stairs, hoping to leave unnoticed. But just as I reached the bottom step, I saw him. Henry was already awake, standing alone in the kitchen, and for a moment we simply looked at each other. In his eyes, I saw a mix of sadness and something that felt almost like determination. "Daisy," he began softly, his voice filled with a weight that was hard to bear. "Hey, I have to go," I stammered, barely able to look at him as I tried to hold back tears. He took a step forward, his hand reaching out slightly as if to stop me, but I pulled back, unable to bear his touch. "I regret what happened, Henry," I said, my voice trembling. "It was a mistake." His face softened, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I understand," he replied, but there was hesitation. "But last night, It was real, wasn't it? His words struck something within me, a painful truth I'd been trying to ignore. Shame surged through me and I shook my head. It doesn't matter. We can't do this, Henry. We can't pretend this won't destroy everything. My voice cracked and I knew I needed to leave, to put distance between myself and the chaos I'd created. Without another word, I turned and made my way toward the door, knowing that whatever happened next, things could never go back to the way they were. I felt like I was standing on a ledge, one step away from plunging into the unknown. I can't live like this, Henry. It's destroying me, I managed, my voice trembling. I had to leave before it was too late. I turned, heart pounding, barely giving him a chance to reply. My only thought was escape, away from him, away from this place filled with guilt and longing, from these emotions tearing me apart. Outside, the morning air hit me with a harsh chill, grounding me in the reality of my choices. The weight of what I'd done pressed down on me, and I knew I'd carry it for a long time. All I wanted was to get as far as possible from this house, from Henry, from the memory of that night. But once I was back in my city, back in the home I shared with Oliver, the guilt only intensified, slowly consuming me. Each day became a test of endurance. Oliver's kindness, his warmth, all the love he gave me, it became a painful reminder of my betrayal. I kept up the facade, smiling, pretending to be the same person I'd been before, but inside I was unraveling. Every hug, every affectionate glance from Oliver felt like a mirror reflecting my deceit. In those moments, the weight of what I'd done seems unbearable. And yet, I couldn't stop thinking about Henry. He came to our city several times over the next few weeks, and each time I told myself it would be the last. But every time he reached out, I found myself drawn back to him, powerless against the pull. Our stolen moments together were filled with passion, yet each one deepened my inner conflict. I knew I had to stop, that I was spiraling further with each meeting, but the attraction only grew stronger, pulling me in like a current I couldn't fight. Oliver began noticing the changes. My irritability, my distance, the way I seemed to drift off in thought. It wasn't like me, and I could see his concern grow. One evening, he gently asked if something was wrong. I brushed it off, blaming fatigue, but I knew he could sense the truth simmering just below the surface. I wanted to tell him to come clean, but the words lodged in my throat. So I continued on, trapped in a storm of guilt and desire, feeling my life spiral out of control. One day, when Henry suggested another meeting, I knew I had reached my breaking point. I didn't respond. I couldn't meet him. Every fiber in me wanted to, but I forced myself to stay away, knowing it was the only way to hold on to any semblance of self-respect. I ignored his messages, silenced his calls. Each day, I fought the urge to go back to him, to let myself fall again, but I knew that if I gave in even once, I'd lose everything. But the struggle didn't end there. The longing for Henry didn't fade. If anything, it grew, a constant ache that wouldn't leave. I was standing on the edge, knowing that any slip could destroy everything. A few weeks later, another family gathering loomed, and I could feel the tension even before we arrived. Being in the same room as Henry again, trying to keep up appearances, was almost too much to bear. I stayed close to Oliver, hoping it would somehow shield me, but the strain was obvious. Charlotte, observant as ever, didn't miss a thing. She watched, her gaze sharp and calculating, catching every strained glance and nervous gesture. At dinner, her eyes seemed to bore into me, even as she smiled and laughed with everyone else. I avoided her gaze, knowing she saw through me, that she could sense something was wrong. By the time the evening ended, I was exhausted, every nerve frayed, barely able to keep the facade from crumbling. A few days later, when the doorbell rang and I opened it to see Charlotte standing there, my heart dropped. She greeted me warmly, but her eyes held a determined glint. I let her in, leading her to the living room, my mind racing. Charlotte started with small talk, her tone casual, but I could sense her building up to something heavier. Finally, the pause broke, and her gaze fixed on mine. "Daisy, I've noticed some changes in you lately," she said gently. "Is there something going on between you and Henry?" Her words were direct, and I felt the ground shift beneath me. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My heart raced, my throat tightening painfully as the weight of my secret bore down on me. I wanted to tell the truth, to confess, to release the guilt tearing me apart, but how could I? How could I betray everyone like this? Charlotte, the words caught in my throat, leaving me floundering, lost. I couldn't meet her gaze. My face burned and I looked away, feeling the shame course through me. Charlotte didn't press, but her silence encouraged me to speak. "Daisy, you can trust me," she said softly, her voice steady. "I'm not here to judge you, but I can see something is eating away at you. You can't keep living like this." Her words struck me deeply, slicing through the turmoil within me. She was offering understanding, a chance to unburden myself, and I felt a faint glimmer of hope. But the fear of what might follow held me back, the realization that my truth would shatter more than just my own world. Noticing my hesitation, Charlotte gently said, "I won't pressure you, Daisy. You need to decide when and to whom you'll share what's troubling you. But please remember, I'm here if you ever need to talk." Her words brought me relief, yet at the same time they stirred even more feelings. Sarah left my house without answering, but her words haunted me for a long time. Her gentle, unwavering offer to listen had cut through my defenses, leaving me feeling exposed and raw. I stood by the door, alone in the stillness, realizing I was running out of time. I couldn't keep hiding from the truth, but I also knew that facing it might mean everything would fall apart. Henry's feelings had only grown stronger. Each meeting between us felt more intense, more impossible to ignore. He'd started hinting that his marriage to Charlotte was empty, that his connection to me was the only thing that felt real to him now. His words haunted me, pulling me deeper into a conflict I didn't know how to resolve. One evening, we met in a secluded spot outside the city, away from prying eyes. It was one of those meetings I'd tried so hard to avoid, but something in me couldn't resist the pull. We sat in his car, a tense silence filling the space between us. Finally, he broke the quiet, his voice low and filled with an aching sincerity. "Daisy, I can't keep living like this. I want to be with you. I'll leave everything for you if that's what it takes." His words hit me hard. I'd known this moment was coming, but the reality was far more overwhelming than I'd anticipated. "Henry, you can't just leave everything. It's not right." My voice shook as I spoke, torn between wanting him and knowing the destruction it would bring. "Why isn't it right, Daisy?" he asked, his gaze piercing mine. "What we have is real. Why should we keep pretending when we could be together?" His words held a painful truth, but they couldn't erase the guilt I felt. "Yes, it's real," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "But what about Oliver? And Charlotte? We'd be destroying their lives, not just our own." Henry took my hands, his voice more insistent. "I'm willing to risk everything for you, Daisy. We can make this work. We can start a new life, just the two of us." Tears filled my eyes as I wrestled with my emotions. Part of me wanted to give in, to let this forbidden desire consume us both. But another part knew it would lead to nothing but ruin. "Henry, we can't. It would be a disaster. We're hurting everyone around us." His determination scared me. "Daisy, don't you see? I'd do anything for you." Before I could respond, he leaned in. His kiss filled with an intensity that took my breath away. For a brief, reckless moment, I let myself fall into it, letting the world disappear. But then reality came rushing back, cold and unyielding. I pulled away, my heart pounding. "No, Henry. We can't do this," I said, my voice trembling. His face was full of confusion and pain as I backed away, my decision finally made. "I have to go," I whispered, and without looking back, I stepped out of the car and headed for the exit. Tears streamed down my cheeks as I left him behind, knowing I could never see him again. This was the end, there was no going back now. I would have to live with the consequences of this decision. In the days that followed, the weight of my choice bore down on me. The guilt and shame festered inside, eating away at me. Oliver noticed, too. Our once warm conversations had turned stilted and formal, every little disagreement turning into a full-blown argument. His kindness, his concern, only made the guilt worse, and I could see that he felt the growing distance between us but didn't know why. One evening, after another tense day, an argument erupted out of nowhere. I don't remember how it started, but it quickly spiraled. Oliver's voice was filled with pain and frustration, desperately trying to understand what was happening. "Daisy, I can't do this anymore," he said. His voice edged with a sadness I hadn't heard before. "It's like you're not even here with me. Do you still love me?" The question hit me like a shockwave. I knew he would ask it sooner or later, but hearing it was still like a dagger to the heart. My throat closed up and fear gripped me. I could lie, keep up the pretense, but I was tired of living this way. "Daisy, tell me the truth. I deserve to know." His voice was soft, pleading. I looked into his eyes, seeing the pain and confusion that had been haunting him, and I knew I couldn't keep this from him any longer. "Oliver, my voice shook and tears filled my eyes. I cheated on you." The words came out as a whisper, but they sounded like thunder in the silence that followed. I watched as his face went pale, his eyes widening in shock and horror. With Henry?" he finally asked, his voice barely audible. I nodded, and the look of betrayal that crossed his face shattered what little was left of my composure. "How could you?" His voice was raw, thick with pain. He took a step back, as if my confession had physically struck him. I didn't know what to say. My entire world felt like it was falling apart. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, but I knew there was no apology that could mend the hurt I'd caused. My body trembled as I stood there, feeling the full weight of what I'd done crashing down around me. Oliver's sudden movement toward the door caught me off guard. "I can't talk to you right now," he said, voice low and full of finality, and he left the house, slamming the door behind him. I stood frozen in place, feeling like the walls were closing in. The realization hit me like a punch. I had lost him, lost the life we'd built together. When the echo of the door faded, I crumpled to the floor, tears streaming down my face, the full weight of my choices pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. Alone in the quiet of the house, everything seemed colorless, devoid of warmth. Days blurred together, the guilt and loneliness hollowing me out. Each moment felt endless, and as time passed, the thought that Oliver would never forgive me became almost unbearable. My mind spiraled deeper into despair, the feeling of hopelessness growing more intense. One evening, with darkness settling around me, I made a decision I never thought I'd make. The pain had become too much, and I convinced myself that escape was the only way out. I climbed to the attic, my heart heavy but my mind clouded with despair. There, I found an old rope and began to set up the chair, every movement weighed down by a strange resistance, like my body was fighting against my mind's dark resolve. Standing on the chair, the loop around my neck, I closed my eyes, trying to find a last moment of peace. My thoughts were a storm of fear and sorrow, but I couldn't see another way forward. Just as I braced myself to take that final step, I heard the front door open downstairs. My heart skipped, and fear washed over me. Oliver had come back. I heard his footsteps as he entered the house, calling my name in confusion. A split second later, the attic door burst open, and I saw his face twisted in horror. "Daisy, no!" he cried, rushing toward me. In an instant, he pulled me down, tearing the rope away and wrapping me in his arms, holding me tightly. His hands trembled, his heartbeat racing against mine as he held me, and I couldn't find any words, still in shock from what I'd nearly done. For a moment we just stood there in silence, holding each other. There was more emotion in that silence than in all the words we'd spoken in recent months. Oliver finally loosened his grip, looking at me with a mixture of pain and deep concern. "Daisy, what were you doing?" he asked, his voice soft but laden with anguish. The tears I'd been holding back poured out. "I couldn't bear it anymore, Oliver," I whispered, my voice choked. "I destroyed everything, and I didn't know how to live with it." His expression softened, and he gently brushed a strand of hair from my face. "I can see how much you regret it," he said, his voice steady, but I could hear the pain underneath. But, Daisy, you can't do this. You shouldn't even think about it. I nodded, unable to speak, the guilt too overwhelming. He took a breath, his voice steady yet filled with a glimmer of hope. We can try to fix this, but you have to be strong. If you're willing to fight for us, I'll be here. But please, promise me you'll never try this again. His words touched something deep within me, sparking a faint hope I thought was long gone. Despite everything, he was offering me a chance to rebuild what I'd broken. Oliver helped me down from the attic, his arm around me as we walked back into the house. In his eyes, I saw the determination to stand by me, no matter the weight of our past. This was my last chance, and I knew I had to take it for both of us. A year has passed since that night. Time hasn't erased the pain, but it's allowed us to begin rebuilding. Each day has been a step forward. Small, sometimes painstaking, but always moving toward a future where trust might one day be restored. There were moments where it felt impossible, where the tension and memories were too much, but each time we found strength to continue, reminding ourselves that true love is built on resilience and sacrifice. It hasn't been easy. Some days, the shadows of the past still linger, and trust, once shattered, takes time and patience to mend. But we've come to understand that love, real love, requires both. And each day we choose to try, together. As the story draws to a close, I can't help but wonder, what would you have done in Daisy's place? Could you have walked away from Henry before things spiraled out of control? Do you think Oliver made the right choice in offering her a second chance? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Remember, no matter how deep your regrets or how painful the mistakes you've made, there is always another way forward. Daisy's actions in the attic were an impulsive, heartbreaking attempt to escape her pain, but that choice could have taken her life, leaving a trail of sorrow for everyone who loved her. In every tough situation, there are other solutions, better ones that don't harm ourselves or those around us. If you're ever struggling, please remember to reach out to a friend, a family member, or a professional. You're not alone, and help is always there when you need it. Sometimes the hardest paths lead to the most meaningful growth. Thank you for listening, and if I missed anything or made any errors in the narration, please let me know. This story was narrated with AI due to microphone and language learning limitations.